Throughout the glorious and terrible history of conquest, one name towers above all others. One warrior, one king, one legend. Alexander the Great.
Never in all the world was there another like him.
Born of a ruthless mother.
He believed that she was a consort of some higher being.
Educated by a brilliant philosopher.
One of the most influential thinkers in the world, Aristotle.
Driven by a domineering father.
They swiftly drew their swords. Then the blood really flowed.
A Macedonian warrior at 14. A general at 18. King at 20. Commanding 40,000 troops, hungry for total war. Leaving a grand legacy and a controversial history that endure to this day. Fall 331 BC. Despite dramatic victories at the Granicus River, Issus, and Tyre, Alexander the Great realizes he can never claim to rule Asia if King Darius remains free. And Darius realizes he will never retain control of Asia without defeating Alexander. The two commanders know an ultimate showdown must take place. Darius chooses the location, camping his forces at the river Bomelos, near the village of Gaugamela. None of Alexander's battles is better documented by ancient historians than the Battle of Gaugamela.
Darius assembled his forces and made everything ready for battle. He had fashioned swords and lances much longer than his earlier types. He had also constructed 200 scythe-bearing chariots, well designed to astonish and terrify the enemy. From each of these were projected out, beyond the trace horses, scythes nearly 1 meter in length, presenting their cutting edges to the front.
The night before the battle, several miles of rolling hills separate the two armies. Alexander's chief general Parmenio and several of his most prominent officers move forward to survey the enemy position.
They were filled with amazement at the sight and remarked to one another that it would have been a very difficult task to defeat an enemy of such strength by engaging him by day. They therefore went to Alexander to persuade him to attack by night, so as to conceal from his men the most terrifying element in the coming struggle, that is the odds against them. It was then that Alexander gave him his celebrated answer: "I will not steal my victory." He was determined that if Darius, he should have no cause to summon up courage for another attempt. He was not to be allowed to blame darkness and night for his failure on this occasion, as at Issus he had blamed the narrow mountain passes and the sea.
And there is this account of how he sat there at night into the darkness, figuring out strategy and tactics, finally got what he wanted, and this is the point, then just fell into a totally undisturbed sleep. And he slept on. And he said, till I got it figured out, I was worried. After that, I was fine. The army got up in the morning, reveille was sounded. Alexander slept on like a baby until finally his staff officers had to wake him.
At this point, Alexander gives his troops the pep talk of their lives, confidently telling them that this battle would decide who would rule the continent of Asia. On the other side of the battlefield, the Persian king Darius is giving a speech of his own. But his mood is more of desperation than of confidence. He tells his troops, "Today will consolidate or terminate an empire greater than any age has seen. Now, it is not glory for which you must fight, it is survival. Our backs are to the wall. I beg you by our country's gods, deliver the Persian people and its honor. from the depths of disgrace.
Slowly but methodically, Alexander's phalanx marches forward in formation to encounter Darius's new rolling weapons.
The scythed chariots swung into action at full gallop and created great alarm and terror among the Macedonians. As the phalanx joined shields, however, all beat upon their shields with their spears as the king had commanded, and a great din arose. In some instances, the horses were killed by javelin casts, and in others they rode through and escaped. But some of them, using the full force of their momentum and applying their steel blades actively, wrought death among the Macedonians in many and various forms. They severed the arms of many, shields and all, and in no small number of cases, cut through necks and sent heads tumbling to the ground with the eyes still open and the expression of the countenance unchanged. And in other cases, they sliced through ribs with mortal gashes and inflicted a quick death.
Facing a king and his army, fighting with superhuman strength and passion to retain control of Asia, Alexander's soldiers find themselves, for the first time, struggling not to win, but simply to survive. The situation looks horribly bleak for the Macedonian general Parmenio, who heroically attempts to maintain order in a valiant struggle with his infantry. He realizes there is only one person who has the capacity to turn the tide of battle: Alexander himself. But Alexander is preoccupied, personally fighting his way toward the chariot bearing King Darius.
Alexander has sighted his adversary through the ranks of cavalry, who were closely massed to guard the lofty chariot in which he stood. The bravest stood fast and were slaughtered in front of their king. They fell upon one another in heaps. As for Darius, all the horrors of the battle were now before his eyes. It had become difficult to turn his chariot around and drive it away, since the wheels were encumbered and entangled with bodies. The king abandoned his chariot and his armor, mounted a mare and rode away. It is believed that he would not have escaped at the moment had not Parmenio sent another party of horsemen, begging Alexander to come to his rescue.
When this news was brought to Alexander, he turned back again from further pursuit, and wheeling round with the companion cavalry, led them with great speed against the right wing of Darius's horsemen. Then ensued the most obstinately contested cavalry fight in the whole engagement. Here about 60 of Alexander's companions fell, but Darius's troops were overcome by Alexander, and as many of them as could force their way through his ranks fled with all their might.
What may have first appeared to be impending doom for Alexander proves to be yet another episode confirming Alexander's genius as a commander. Realizing that Darius is relying not on his infantry, but massed squadrons of heavily armed horsemen, Alexander tempts both of Darius's cavalry wings to charge his echelon flanks. Alexander hopes that the flanks can hold out just long enough to create a gap in the Persian line, allowing Alexander's companion cavalry to punch through, which they do with perfect timing. Historians past and present consider the strategy masterful.
Alexander had a tactical brilliance there. The only thing that one can perhaps criticize is that he left the battlefield in pursuit of Darius, trying to get hold of him alive.
Alexander wheels around and starts off in pursuit of Darius once more, keeping up the chase as long as there is daylight. Parmenio's brigade also follows, but when darkness falls, Alexander stops to rest his men and horses. Darius continues to ride away, leaving behind his chariot, spear, and bow. Again, Darius escapes.
Although the Macedonian army is grossly outnumbered, The casualty figures reported by historians are nothing short of astounding. Some say incredible.
Of Alexander's men, about 100 were killed, and more than 1,000 of his horses were lost, either from wounds or from fatigue in the pursuit. Of Darius' forces, there were said to have been 300,000 slain, and far more were taken prisoner than were killed.
The Battle of Gaugamela leaves no doubt that Persia is now under Alexander's control. But of far greater importance for the warrior king is the capture of King Darius. Alexander knows Darius will be far more valuable governing Persia under his command than as a deceased ruler. But would he be able to capture the fallen king alive? Alexander's victory at the Battle of Gaugamela is viewed by many as the most significant triumph in his conquest of Asia.
After the battle had ended in this way, the authority of the Persian Empire was regarded as having been completely overthrown. Alexander was proclaimed King of Asia, and after offering splendid sacrifices to the gods, he proceeded to reward his friends with riches, estates, and governorships.
Within 4 months of his victory at Gaugamela, in January of 330 BC, Alexander takes over Darius's palace and the city of Persepolis in ancient Persia. Now, all of Persia, its capital city, and literally tons of gold and silver bullion belong to Alexander.
The minimum estimate is of 180,000 talents of it, and you have to remember that a talent is 57.5 pounds weight. This made him the richest man in the known world. He could do what he liked. He could call himself God if he wanted.
It's like taking over the whole of Fort Knox one afternoon, and that treasure was evacuated and sent in a great bullion train escorted by 6,000 Macedonians.
Alexander described Persepolis to the Macedonians as the most hateful of the cities of Asia and gave it over to his soldiers to plunder. The Macedonians raced into it, slaughtering all the men whom they met and plundering their residences. Such was their exceeding lust for loot that they fought with each other and killed many of their fellows who had appropriated a greater portion of it. Some cut off the hands of those who were grasping at disputed property, being driven mad by their passions.
Basking in the spoils of victory, Alexander remains with his army at Persepolis 4 months before continuing his conquest of Asia.
Alexander had some great natural gifts, but all those were marred by his inexcusable fondness for drink. At a daytime drinking party, a courtesan claimed that if Alexander gave the order to burn the Persian palace, he would earn the deepest gratitude among the Greeks. The king was enthusiastic. "Why do we not revenge Greece, then, and put the city to the torch?" Alexander took the lead, setting fire to the palace, to be followed by his drinking companions. Such was the end of the palace that ruled all the East. The Macedonians were ashamed that a city of such distinction had been destroyed by their king during a drunken orgy. As for Alexander, it is generally agreed that when sleep had brought him back to his senses after his drunken bout, he regretted his actions.
By the summer of 330 BC, there is little doubt, at least in Alexander's mind, that he rules Asia. But it isn't enough for Alexander to control Darius's kingdom. He passionately continues to pursue Darius, not to kill him, but to take him prisoner.
It was, I suppose, the ultimate in legitimizing. The previous ruler recognizes him not merely as the conqueror, but as the natural monarch of Persia, and almost abdicates for him. How long he would have lived after that, we don't know, but I'm sure that was the thinking behind it.
The other important reason for getting his hands on Darius, either dead or alive, was to make sure, and alive is better than dead, to make sure that no pretenders pop up. He's fighting against a culture that is used to having pretenders pop up and say, I'm Darius. No, I'm Darius. No, I'm Darius. And the reason why this could occur is because there's no ABC, NBC, CBS, there's no CNN, there's no C-SPAN. The only way you could be absolutely certain that you had gained control of the king of the previous dynasty and say, we're done with this dynasty, is to have him alive in your possession.
When Alexander learns Darius is heading north, he again takes up the chase.
So rapid was the march that many of the men, unable to stand the pace, dropped out. A number of horses were worked to death, but Alexander pressed on, regardless of loss. At this juncture, two important persons in Darius' army sought an interview with Alexander. They reported that Darius had been forcibly seized and put under arrest by his own commanders. Bessus, one of his generals, had assumed power in his place. Instantly, Alexander was on the march again, with greater rapidity than ever.
June 330 BC. Alexander's army marches day and night to catch up with the Persian army under the control of Bessus. Within 2 weeks, Alexander has the Persian troops in sight. Even though the Persian army is still far greater in number than that of Alexander, thousands of Persian soldiers surrender. Bessus, however, would not allow such a fate for Darius.
Bessus and his fellow conspirators came to Darius' wagon and started urging him to mount a horse and flee to escape his enemy. Darius, however, declared that the gods had come to avenge him and, calling for Alexander's protection, refused to go along with the traitors. At this, they were furious. They hurled their spears at the king and left him there, run through many times. They also maimed his animals to prevent them advancing any further. Deprived of their leaders, the barbarians scattered wherever hope or panic directed them.
With the great and powerful Darius lying severely wounded, only time would dictate whether Alexander would be able to capture him alive. When Alexander's forces finally catch up to the fleeing Persian troops, they find Darius barely clinging to life.
They found him at his last gasp. He asked for a drink, and he swallowed some cold water, which a Macedonian brought him. He said, "This is the final stroke of misfortune, that I should accept a service from you and not be able to return it. But Alexander will reward you for your kindness, and the gods will repay him for his courtesy towards my mother and my wife and my children." As he said this, he took the Macedonian by the hand and died. When Alexander came up, he showed his grief and distress at the king's death, and unfastening his own cloak, he threw it over the body and covered it. Later, after he captured Bessus, who had murdered the king, Alexander had the tops of two straight trees bent down so that they met, and part of Bessus's body was tied to each. Then when each tree was let go and sprang back to its upright position, the part of the body attached to it was torn off by the recoil. As for Darius's body, he sent it to his mother to be laid out in royal state.
With Darius dead, Alexander's conquest will ultimately be assured. But in the ensuing months, Alexander faces new enemies within his own army and within himself. With Persia under Alexander's control and King Darius dead, the mission of Alexander the Great is essentially complete. But Alexander now faces new dilemmas, far more complex than waging war.
It's very revealing that it's after Gaugamela that the restlessness among the troops really begins to start, on the very reasonable basis that, look, we've done what we were set out to do. We have destroyed the control of the Persian Empire. We've done it. Now let's go home.
At this time, Alexander becomes acutely aware of potential threats to his power.
Among the Macedonians at this time, few men enjoyed a more prominent position than Philotas, the son of Parmenio. When Darius had been defeated, a beautiful Greek girl named Antigone was handed over to Philotas. He confided to her that all the greatest achievements in this campaign had been the work of his father and himself. Antigone repeated these remarks privately to Alexander. Once the king had begun to listen to these insinuations, Philotas's enemies brought innumerable accusations against them, including conspiracy. Philotas was executed, and immediately afterwards, Alexander had Parmenio put to death as well. This was a man who had rendered many great services to Philip and who, of all Alexander's older friends, had urged him more strongly to undertake the invasion of Asia.
It is now widely believed that Alexander always had concerns about the loyalty of Parmenio and his son Philotas. For all practical purposes, the account given to him by Antigone gives Alexander the opportunity to take strong action he may have been considering for years. In October 330 BC, Alexander makes his close friend Hephaestion joint commander of the Companion Cavalry. The Macedonian army, now on the march for more than 7 years, moves towards India, and Alexander's erratic behavior continues.
In 327 BC, at the age of 29, Alexander does something that is so out of character, it shocks even his closest associates, particularly his lifelong male companion and rumored lover, Hephaestion. Alexander takes a wife. This is Roxane, the beautiful daughter of Oxyates, a baron whose mountain stronghold of the Sogdian rocks has been captured by Alexander. But why does Alexander marry? Well, it's a good political alliance with the local nobility, and there's a chance of producing a legitimate heir for his vast empire. But some ancient historians write that Alexander may indeed have had genuine romantic feelings for Roxane.
Men who took part in the campaign used to say she was the loveliest woman they had seen in Asia. Alexander fell in love with her at sight, but captive though she was, he refused, for all his passion, to force her to his will, and condescended to marry her.
Alexander confounds his associates even further when he decides that those under his rule should honor an ancient Persian tradition.
For the ruler of the Persian Empire, it was essential to be seen to receive proskinesis from his subjects. Now, for the Persians, this is a matter of respect, a simple kiss of the hand. It could be combined with a bow, or with kneeling, or even prostration, face down on the ground. But for the Greeks, this gesture is a form of worship exclusively reserved for the gods. Alexander's command is hotly contested by his followers, and Callisthenes, his official historian, refuses to do it. He speaks boldly to his longtime friend. You should remember Greece. For her sake you undertook this expedition into Asia. When you return home, will you force the Greeks, the greatest freedom lovers of all, to bow down before you? From this point, Callisthenes loses the favor of Alexander. And as so many have discovered before him, that can be a tragic mistake.
Alexander orders Callisthenes, his own historian, to be executed.
All it meant to Alexander was that here was this damned intellectual who'd served his purpose and was now becoming a nuisance and was therefore expendable. And being expendable, he was thereupon expended.
Alexander's desire to pursue Persian tradition slowly evolves into a life of hedonism.
He clearly saw himself as a god, and he was being treated as a god. People have been reluctant to believe this because they think of Alexander through modern lenses. No one these days thinks of himself as a god unless he's nuts. But what of Alexander?
Alexander now began to imitate the Persian luxury. He dressed himself in a white robe and a Persian sash. He added concubines to his retinue in the manner of Darius, in numbering not less than the days of the year and outstanding in beauty. Each night, these paraded about the couch of the king so that he might select the one with whom he would lie that night.
Alexander could better cope with warfare than peace and leisure. As soon as he was free of these worries that beset him, he yielded to dissipation, and the man whom the arms of Persia had failed to crush fell before its vices. There were parties early in the day, drinking and mad revelry throughout the night. It was a general decline into the ways of the foreigner. By affecting these as though they were superior to those of his own country, Alexander so offended the sensibilities and eyes of his people that most of his friends began to regard him as an enemy.
His long-sought conquest of Asia complete, Alexander continues to want more. In early 326 BC, he begins a campaign in India, where King Porus attempts to stop him at the river Hydaspes. Alexander's forces find themselves fighting an enemy not riding just horses, but elephants. While the Macedonians prevail, the contest is the most difficult they have fought.
A consequence of this battle with Porus was that it blunted the edge of the Macedonians' courage and made them determined not to advance any further into India. At first, Alexander was so overcome with disappointment and anger that he shut himself up and lay prostrate in his tent. His soldiers crowded round the entrance and pleaded with him, uttering loud cries and lamentations, until finally he relented and gave orders to break camp. Alexander was now eager to see the outer ocean. He had a large number of oar-propelled ferries and rafts constructed, and was rowed down the rivers on these at a leisurely speed. But his voyage was by no means a peaceful affair.
As Alexander travels downstream, he will land, assault the cities near the banks, and subdue them all. Then comes the walled city of Mali, home of the independent tribe of Malians.
Alexander neared the city and thought to take it by storm. One of the seers came to him and reported that there had been revealed to him a great danger which would come to the king from a wound in the course of the operation. He begged Alexander to leave the city alone for the present and to turn his mind to other activities. The king scolded him for dampening the enthusiasm of the soldiers, and then, disposing his army for the attack, led the way in person to the city, eager to reduce it by force.
Alexander stationed his infantry in a ring around the outer defenses and moved up in close formation. The defenders took refuge in their inner stronghold. Here, they continued to resist, and not without success, for they turned and fell upon a small party of Macedonians, driving some of them out again and killing about 25 before they could get away. Alexander, meanwhile, brought the scaling ladders into position all around the inner stronghold.
But the men with the ladders are too slow for Alexander. Impatiently, he grabs one himself, leans against the fortress wall, and is the very first to climb to the top, cutting down at the enemy left and right, until suddenly Alexander stands alone. To the horror of his men down below, he is now a perfect target for enemy archers. What he should do now is go back, jump down to rejoin his men. But what he does do is jump forward, inside the enemy fortress, where, in hand-to-hand combat, he fights for his life. Horrified, the Macedonians rush for the walls in such numbers, they break their own ladders. Only 3 of them manage to join him inside the fortress, including the bearer of Alexander's Trojan shield. 2 of the Macedonians are cut down by the enemy, and Alexander himself receives an arrow which penetrates his body armor and pierces his lung. The 4th Macedonian defends his leader with the great shield of Troy. Desperately, Alexander's army finally manages to scale the walls, and they witness an impossible sight. Their invincible leader lying on the ground in a pool of blood.
For Alexander, leading the charge to take on the enemy at Mali in 326 BC is nothing new. The wound he receives is but one of several he suffers on the fields of battle. But for the seemingly invincible warrior, this injury is different. Alexander's troops realize it is life-threatening.
Immediately, the rumor ran through the camp that Alexander had been killed. Meanwhile, his attendants, with great difficulty, sawed off the wooden shaft of the arrow and thus succeeded in removing his breastplate. They then had to cut out the arrowhead, which was embedded between his ribs. When it was extracted, the king fainted away and came very near to death. Even when the danger was past, he remained weak and for a long time needed careful nursing.
Slowly, Alexander recuperates. During the next 2 years, he heads his army west back towards Greece, half by land, half by sea. In July of 324 BC, Alexander suffers an even deeper hurt. His close friend Hephaestion dies of an unknown illness. Alexander is devastated.
We are told that Alexander flung himself on the body of his friend and lay there nearly all day long in tears and refused to be parted from him until he was dragged away. Some have said that he had Hephaestion's doctor hanged for giving the wrong medicine. All the accounts agree that for 2 whole days after Hephaestion's death, Alexander tasted no food and paid no attention in any way to his bodily needs, but lay on his bed, crying.
I think Hephaestion, because of his close personal relationship with Alexander, was one of these confidants. And when Alexander lost him, he lost a very, very close ally in developing policy. And you might even say that he begins to go downhill after Hephaestion's death, that he shows signs of losing some will after Hephaestion's death.
Less than 1 year after Hephaestion dies, Alexander rests in Babylon, planning a possible conquest of Arabia, when he too becomes ill. During a 10-day period, what begins as a mild fever evolves into a mysterious, life-threatening illness.
The soldiers were passionately eager to see him. Some hoped for a sight of him while he was still alive. Others wished to see his body, for a report had gone round that he was already dead, and they suspected that his death was being concealed by his guards. But nothing could keep them from a sight of him. And the motive in almost every heart was grief. and a sort of helpless bewilderment at the thought of losing their king.
It is at this critical moment when the enormity of Alexander's influence is acutely felt by all who know him.
It is my belief that there was in those days no nation, no city, no single individual beyond the reach of Alexander's name. Never in all the world was there another like him. And therefore I cannot but feel that some power more than human was concerned in his birth. I have admittedly found fault with some of the things which Alexander did. But of the man himself, I'm not ashamed to express ungrudging admiration.
It is also at this moment when Alexander's officers begin to question what will happen if Alexander dies. Who would rule the conquered territories? The prospect of ruling such a vast empire without Alexander is a daunting one. There is no doubt among Alexander's officers that no single human being could ever take his place. The territories would have to be divided. They also know that if Alexander himself does not proclaim who will inherit which regions, fierce jealousy would rear its ugly head, resulting in wars between the very leaders who fought united under the banner of one mighty king. Would Alexander be able to defeat his illness, resume his conquest, and lead his loyal forces to even greater glory? Or would he finally prove that he is not the immortal son of Zeus by dying the death of a mere mortal?
Late in the evening of June the 9th, 323 BC, a group of Alexander's officers keep vigil as their king's condition worsens. He tells them, "I foresee a great funeral battle over me." Towards the end, they gather round his bedside to ask the critical question, to whom will he bequeath his kingdom? Weakly, Alexander whispers his last words, "Kratisto," to the strongest. Early in the morning of June the 10th, his eyes close forever.
For centuries, historians have debated the cause of Alexander's death, from alcoholism to poisoning to compulsive self-destruction.
If we're asking what killed him, you've got a whole smorgasbord to pick from. And again, funnily enough, it might be a case of all things conspiring together. He never really got over that terrible shovel-headed arrow wound that he got in India. That really nearly killed him. There is also the probably endemic malaria, whatever disease it was that he had during his last days.
I feel that Alexander died ultimately because he pushed himself too hard. With Alexander, he has this wonderful military campaign and then dies. Well, for him, that's kind of a good thing for him, because I'm not sure he would have been real good as an administrator. Again, it comes back to your own personal opinion about what exactly made Alexander so great. But my feeling is that Alexander would have pushed himself until he died or burned out. And I think that had it not happened in 323, it would have happened in 321, or it would have happened in 320. I don't see Alexander mellowing out and living into an old age.
Just as in life, Alexander was a powerful figure, so too in death. His corpse, while en route home to Greece, finds its final resting place instead in Alexandria, Egypt.
In the chaos that follows Alexander's death, his embalmed body becomes a major asset. Alexander had said that he wished to be buried at Siwa with his spiritual father, the god Zeus Ammon. but the Macedonians want their noble leader to be buried at home. As the body is being transported by land in a golden sarcophagus, it is hijacked by soldiers under the command of Alexander's former general Ptolemy, now the new ruler of Egypt. Controlling the body of Alexander lends new power to the reputation of Ptolemy and his successors. For several hundred years, Alexander's sarcophagus is viewed here by thousands, including Julius Caesar. But when the Ptolemaic pharaohs fall from power after the death of Cleopatra, they lose control of Alexander's remains.
Today, no one is certain exactly where the remains of Alexander are located. Most agree they are buried beneath the streets of Alexandria, most probably near the Mosque of Daniel. The mosque is very active, with prayer services held every day.
If Alexander the Great was indeed buried somewhere near the Mosque of Daniel, then it's likely that he would have been brought here, part of the labyrinth of tunnels underneath all of Alexandria. These were designed as cisterns for the storage of water, and this particular one is directly underneath the mosque. This is believed to be a holy place where the bodies of religious leaders have long been buried. Many attempts have been made to find Alexander's remains, but so far, none have come even close to success.
The death of Alexander the Great brings to a close a conquest never again equaled by any warrior at any time in history. The statistics alone are staggering. One man leading 40,000 soldiers by foot and horseback, more than 20,000 miles over 12 years. The vast kingdom which Alexander fought so hard to build over a 12-year period ultimately becomes divided among more than 20 rulers.
Today, historians, scholars, and soldiers continue to debate the complex character of King Alexander of Macedon. Why do we call him Alexander the Great? Most agree he was the finest military commander that ever lived. He also created a cultural exchange between East and West that became a pivotal point in human history. But he gained his empire at a huge cost of death and destruction. If he had lived, how much further would he have gone? Perhaps we are fortunate that we will never know. At the end of his short life, Alexander was walking a fine line between genius and insanity.
Alexander gives an example to the world of a general, the likes of which we have never seen since. Every major general compares himself to Alexander, and I think most every major general feels that somehow he falls short of Alexander.
Alexander himself was so powerful a figure that during his lifetime, men who afterwards became great kings, marshals, and leaders, while he lived, they were no more than senior officers, lions to his lion tamer. And even after his death, they were still so scared of him that in council meetings, his crown, his scepter, his royal robe presided at the head of the table. He was still there for them, even though he was dead.
Alexander appears to have had not one moment of self-doubt, not one moment of fear. Whether he was a god or not, he certainly had the confidence of one. He had an absolute vision of his own greatness, and in the end, we are forced to agree with him. He is, and will always remain, Alexander the Great.